Here's a House hearing on the government's tracking of terrorist finances. The Treasury Department Undersecretary testified to a House subcommittee on the legality of the program. This is about 2 hours.
This hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation will come to order. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of a record. I wanted to point out that during World War II, Congressman Andrew May returned from an oversight visit to the Pacific Theater and told a group of reporters that those with loved ones serving in submarines didn't need to worry, because the Japanese were setting their depth charges to detonate at a level that was too shallow to reach our submarines. Several newspapers reported this. The Japanese then subsequently reset the fuses on their depth charges. A vice admiral estimated that the public disclosure of this information cost us 10 submarines and the lives of 800 American men. During the mid-1970s, committees chaired by Senator Frank Church and Congressman Otis Pike brought to the attention of the American public a litany of activities which showed an intelligence community that had, at times, overstepped its bounds, leading to the enactment of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I cite these instances not to draw comparisons with the subject of the hearing today, but rather to demonstrate the cross pressures that we all confront when dealing with matters of secrecy and national security. No member wants to undermine our national security. We all recognize that there are times in war, as Churchill said, when certain truths must be, and I quote, attended by a bodyguard of lies, unquote. As a New Yorker and representative of so many people who are deeply affected by terrorism, I could not feel more strongly about protecting our vital national security tools. Just the same, no member wants to forego the institutional obligation envisioned by the Founding Fathers. We work always to strike a structural balance that James Madison articulated very well in Federalist Paper number 51. The hearing today is to examine Terror Finance Tracking Program and to examine the merits of the program and to see if it has been properly created and implemented by the administration. Along with Chairman Oxley and my colleague, Mr. Gutierrez, and my colleague, Mr. Frank, I have spent as much time on terror finance as any member in this body. We have held many hearings. We have established a bipartisan task force on terror finance. And in 2004, I even authored an amendment which authorized the government to monitor cross-border wire transfers. My record properly suggests that I would support a sophisticated and aggressive program similar to what has been described by the media. While many terrorist operatives are increasingly resorting to cash couriers and to move funds, charities and wealthy donors who support terrorists are likely to have used the SWIFT program are likely to have used the SWIFT system that this program specifically targets. It would be foolish to ignore that. Furthermore, this program has the support of several important people outside the administration who are familiar with the workings of the program. People like Chairman Oxley, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, and former officials such as Dennis Lormel, former head of the FBI's Terror Financial Unit. That said, many people in Congress who should have been briefed by this administration were not. And while I appreciated the visit last week from Undersecretary Levey, after the program's existence was reported in the media, our oversight obligations are far from fulfilled. I believe that the skepticism the administration afforded this Congress, perhaps properly, regarding the Terror Finance Tracking Program must be reciprocated. We must ensure that an environment of accountability is provided for all government, everyone in government, who deals with the sensitive financial information. In our letter, our colleague in a letter our colleague, Intelligence Chairman Hoekstra, recently sent to President Bush about withholding information from Congress. He mentions how he expects it to reinforce an important question in the minds of all members. What else is it that we don't know? What else don't we know? So in addition to this hearing, I'm going to ask Undersecretary Levey to come back here to brief this subcommittee to answer any questions he cannot answer in public forum today. I will also conduct a follow-up hearing on this subject in September to allow the private sector witnesses to discuss pros and cons of this program. Additionally, I am asking the GAO to conduct an investigation into this program to ensure that it was indeed conducted in accordance with all proper laws, that it does possess all necessary safeguards, and that Congress was appropriately informed. This GAO investigation is mere due diligence and is going to help ensure that our trust is not poorly placed in the Treasury Department. I want to thank Undersecretary Levey for coming here today. I have a deep respect for Undersecretary Levey, and I believe he's doing an excellent job at Treasury. We understand he did not make many of the decisions about disclosure to Congress, and that there are many things he cannot discuss in an open setting. However, I do look forward to an informative discussion on this matter today. And with that, I turn to our ranking chairman, Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Madam Chair, from your lips. I am here today in the absence of the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Gutierrez, who's missed his plane. He flies out of Chicago, and those things will happen. I begin by expressing my appreciation for your statement, Madam Chair. I think you have laid out what exactly the issues are here, namely the extent to which our fight against terrorism is going to be a genuinely collaborative effort between the executive branch and Congress. And I think you were right to point to the broad support for this program. I don't know any member of Congress who thinks we should not be tracking the finances of terrorists. The resolution which I offered, which was widely supported by people on my side of the aisle and a few on the other side, explicitly affirmed that. My problem is that this administration, by its pattern of rejecting the notion of congressional collaboration, has made this controversial. That's where the controversies come in. There was not a great deal of controversy about the substance. There's wide agreement that we should be tracking the financing of terrorists in many ways. As the gentlewoman from New York has said, we in this committee have sometimes been pushing the administration to do even more in that area than it wanted to do. The problem is, and it's not an isolated instance, we've seen it in area after area. I have come genuinely to believe that the fact that the Congress would have been willing to be cooperative is not only irrelevant, but seen by the administration as problematic. That is, I believe this administration would rather do things unilaterally without inviting congressional collaboration, because the dominant factors in this administration genuinely believe that increased executive authority, unhindered and unhampered by interference from the Congress, is essential. And we've seen this in a number of areas. To be honest, I have come to believe that the people in this administration have a different view of democracy than the one that I have. I want to be very clear. This is not a case of my accusing them of not being democratic. Those on the left who make those accusations, I think, are wrong. The question is, how do you define democracy? I think this administration prefers the model of having the single decision maker elected every 4 years and basically entrusting most of the important decisions to that decision maker. And the willingness of the Congress to cooperate, that the gentlewoman from New York correctly pointed out, is rebuffed, because they think, okay, if we let them agree with us on this issue, then they will have established the right to disagree with us on another. There would not have been any problem with this program. And the proof of that is the briefing pattern. Now, we are supposed to be briefed on these things. I have the list here of the members who were briefed on this program. Let me start with a story. On May 11th, I was invited to a briefing. I went into the secret elevator, up to the secret room, and I took out my cell phone because, who knew what might be listening on my cell phone? And two people from, I guess, Treasury, I never even knew, said, we're going to tell you about something that's about to be made public. The conversation I had, the only time I've had a comparable, or heard a comparable conversation, it was between Groucho and Chico. They said to me, okay, we're going to tell you something that's about to be made public. I said, well, is it going to be made public because you want it to be? No, it's going to be in the newspaper. Oh, okay, in other words, you're telling me this only because it's going to be in the newspaper. Correct. Well, now I have a question. Since you're only telling me this that it's going to be in the newspaper, when it's in the newspaper, can I then talk about it? No. So here's the briefing I was offered. I was offered a briefing about something only because it was about to be made public anyway. And the purpose of telling me this, I believe, was so that once I heard about it first from them, I couldn't talk about it in the newspaper. Now, let me read. There have been 28 members of the House briefed on this program. 2 were briefed in March of '02, a few months after it started. 1 in 2003, 2 in 2005, and 23 on the 11th of May, 2006. In other words, the briefings were overwhelmingly after the administration knew it was being made public. These were briefings to after the fact. This is the exact opposite. And let me put it this way. When you brief us, and by the way, as I read this, no member of this committee was briefed until the 11th of May, when the chairman of the committee and I were invited to the briefing room. And I was never briefed. Let me say, by the way, I don't want to get myself in any more trouble than I might otherwise be. I declined the briefing when I was told that I was being briefed only because it was going to be made public anyway, and the consequence of my being briefed would be that I couldn't discuss the program. I excused myself, and I did tell Treasury, and I would repeat this, Mr. Levey, if you ever want to tell me about something that I'm not going to read in the newspaper, I will be available. But otherwise, you can trust me to read the papers on my own. I'll be okay with that. If I miss an issue, I may call to see if I can, have you mail me one. But I don't need you to give me the oral version. It's like, to some extent, I guess Treasury saw itself in that position. The role model here was Fiorello LaGuardia reading the comics to the people of New York during the newspaper strike. As long as the newspapers are available, I'll get them myself. But that's the problem. The briefing pattern shows it. You briefed very few members of Congress. Only 2 members were briefed between 2003 and the program being made public. Now, here's the problem with this, and I'll wind this up, Madam Chair. Appreciate your indulgence. Yes, of course we think that this program should go forward. And why do we want to be briefed, and why do we want to have oversight? And let me summarize it this way. I strongly believe that you and the other law enforcement people are the good guys, and you're fighting the bad guys. But you're not the perfect guys. And my problem is that your model seems to assume you're the perfect guys, that you won't make mistakes, that you don't need to be checked, that you can just do this all on your own. And what I want to do is to give you all the powers you can to fight the terrorists, to fight the bad guys. But I don't think anybody ought to be given enormous power, and that's what you're going to be given because we have an enormous task, and not have checks. And no matter what kind of internal checks you have, I don't think they will ever be enough. I think congressional oversight makes sense. I think the gentleman from New York is correct. She and others have a very good record in being very supportive of this effort against terrorism. And you have rebuffed us. And I think that is a mistake. And consequently, that's why a program that should not have been terribly controversial has become controversial. So I hope that with the program the gentlewoman has outlined, we will now begin a period of real cooperation, and that in the future there will be a voluntary effort on your part to do this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. Chairman of our committee, Mr. Oxley.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Secretary Levey, thank you for appearing today. And we are pleased to have you here. And the obvious reason for this hearing was to discuss the positive aspects of this program and how effective it has been. I think there's very little argument in the Congress of how effective that has been. The issue raised this morning, of course, was who was briefed and when and so forth. And frankly, I'm confident that the administration did the right thing in very selectively informing the Intelligence Committee. We are not the Intelligence Committee, in case you haven't noticed. And the Intelligence Committee did their work very effectively. How many people were briefed and when it occurred seems to be relatively irrelevant, since the program was up and running, and I think there was general consensus it was very effective. And obviously, the fewer people that know about that program, that secret program, the better, and that the revelations that appeared in the popular media clearly had a negative effect on the effectiveness of that program. I'm sure you're going to testify to that later. I keep coming back to the warnings or the concern that were expressed, particularly by the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, two well-respected gentlemen, Governor Kane and, of course, our former colleague Lee Hamilton. Why would those two individuals, well-respected, plead with the news media, in this case the New York Times, not to reveal that information? It seems to me that it goes to the heart of this entire issue, and it was frankly never answered during the debate and the resolution that we had a week or so ago. And so we keep coming back to that very poignant issue. And by the way, they weren't the only two that were trying to keep that program secret, because obviously the terrorists, once they get that information, change their habits, the New York Times editorial board to the contrary notwithstanding. It's amazing how much the editorial board at the New York Times understands about terrorist actions and finances, but that's for another day. It seems to me that, again, coming back to this purpose of this hearing, is to describe how effective the program has been and the potential and real damage it has caused. When this committee debated and voted on the terrorist financing part of the Patriot Act, it was this kind of program that we clearly had in mind. And if you look at the editorial, New York Times, shortly after 9/11, they called upon the administration to do exactly what the administration did. And sometimes I'm concerned that maybe the effectiveness of the program is what really upsets some folks in the media. But we have, in this committee, I think, set the framework in the terrorist financing provisions and anti-money laundering provisions of the Patriot Act that really allowed the administration to do this effective program that has, I think, been severely weakened by the revelations that occurred in the popular press, and I find that to be very upsetting. And by the way, this is not the first time that we've had this kind of situation where you've had unauthorized leaks from what I think is frankly treason, and it's been reported in the popular press for whatever reason. This is at least the third time we've had that situation occur. And as one of my colleagues said on the floor, nobody is happier about these revelations than those who would harm us. And I find that incredibly upsetting and of a real concern as chairman of this committee that we would find ourselves in that position today, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, have you an opening statement?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Levey, for being here today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have a brief conversation with you and hear your testimony. I really appreciate the statement, the strong opening statement made by our chair, and I really do mean that sincerely. I believe what she said, I believe what the ranking member said, that every member of Congress wants to protect our country. Nobody wants any harm, any more harm to come to our country. That's not the issue, and that's not the question. When I disagree with somebody, I try to at least understand why they do what they do so I can work with it. And I really truly believe had the President, had the administration come to this Congress after September 11 and said, look, the whole world has changed. We need to look at the FISA law, which has been in effect since 1978, and I understand there were about 17,000 applications and only 6 or 8 or 10 rejections out of 17,000. I was a district attorney for 12 years, and I never had that kind of record, a batting average, when I went to get search warrants. And I just think that's an exceptional number. And my point by saying that is this: if the President had come to Congress and said, look, the whole world's changed, we need to change the FISA law, we need to enact some new laws regarding wire transfers and bank transactions in other countries, I think Congress would have lined up, Republicans and Democrats, this is not about partisan politics, and said, Mr. President, we'll do anything reasonable you ask, and I mean that very sincerely. And that's what I invite and encourage the administration to do in the future. If there's something like this in this war on terror, we need to work together. We are all Americans, and we all want to protect our country. And I say this with the greatest respect and sincerity. I hope the administration will come to Congress and say, we need to change the laws in this area, and if they do that, I really believe, I honest to God believe, that we will work together with the President to do what's anything reasonable to protect our country. And so I look forward to hearing your testimony today, Mr. Secretary Levey, and look forward to asking you some questions, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm going to turn to Mr. Paul in 1 minute, but because there are a number of people here, and I know that the Undersecretary is going to need to leave, I'm going to ask all members to shorten their opening statements to a 2-minute rather than a 5-minute statement with unanimous consent. Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I know today it's not very appropriate to bring up the subject of the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment, and I'm not going to pursue that, but I am always concerned about the legal authority for what our government does. The whole issue of whether or not subpoenas are issued under probable cause is really questionable. And I, too, like everybody else, want to do whatever we can to find out what the terrorists are planning to do. But I want to just take a minute to make the point about the practicality of what we do. Quite frankly, I don't think the terrorists were tipped off to anything. You know, we've been monitoring financial transactions for 30 years, and they know what's going on. As a matter of fact, they have been suspicious to the degree that they essentially don't use the system anymore. They've gone to this Hawala type of system, which is off the books, and therefore all the effort that we put forth may be wasted effort and may be confusing things. This assumption that more is better, spend more money, have more reports, have more subpoenas, can actually backfire on us. And I want to just quote a UN report after, that came out after 9/11. Matter of fact, it came out in May of 2002. And this dealt with a $69,000 wire transfer that Mohammed Atta, leader of the hijackers, received from the United Arab Emirates. The report noted that this particular transaction was not noticed quickly enough because the report was just one of a very large number and was not distinguishable from those related to other financial crimes. So therefore, this idea that we just need more financial surveillance, but since the Bank Secrecy Act, FinCEN's been around, we've had executive orders, we have the SWIFT program, and to think for a minute that the hijackers aren't going to be very knowledgeable about this, I just think we're kidding ourselves. And this whole idea of more is better, I think, needs to be questioned. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, Chairman Kelly and Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. Our oversight is legally required under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law the administration is using to support this initiative. But the administration has kept Congress in the dark. Although Treasury started subpoenaing data from SWIFT in October of 2001, only 3 present members of this body were informed about the program before May 11, 2006. Even though this committee has jurisdiction, most of us learned about the depth of this program only from the New York Times when it published its article on June 23rd of this year. Apparently, congressional notification occurs when the New York Times is delivered to our office. The administration's intentional failure to consult with Congress for 5 years, even though it is clearly required by the law they argue supports this program, is part of a very disturbing pattern. As the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Chairman Hoekstra, noted over the weekend, the administration needs to be reminded that keeping Congress informed of intelligence programs is not optional. It is a legal requirement. Congressman Hoekstra's comments echo those of the Supreme Court in reviewing the Guantanamo Bay tribunals. The administration needs to remember that this is a country where there are 3 branches of government. I would just like to say that when the Times brought this program to our attention, it was condemned by the administration. But these are the same types of charges leveled against the same paper that we heard about with the Pentagon Papers. But despite the statement of the President and Secretary Snow, no one was exactly surprised that the U.S. government is monitoring international wire transfers. And I have here a list of public statements in papers across this country, in Canada, Australia, about the SWIFT program and our government's monitoring of it. And I request permission to place this in the record and would note that the interns in my office compiled it in just 2 days. And it's quite extensive. So no one was surprised. I request permission to put my entire statement in the record.
So moved.
And the press clippings.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we face 2 issues here. I appreciate you coming, Mr. Secretary. One is the ability to act, and second is the issue of how we manage an effective oversight program from a constitutional perspective. I think it was extremely regrettable and frankly reprehensible that the New York Times published this information. I'm thoroughly familiar with the Hawala networks myself from my experience and study with the Middle East. However, I think the bigger aspect is their selectivity in information that they've shared. Particularly since they called for this type of a program in an editorial on September 24th, 2001. However, when we look at this ability to act, I think one of the deeper issues is that we need collaboration as opposed to briefing. I've been in plenty of briefings during my time in the House where that were classified and all of the information was available online or in public media sources. I would question the status of the classification, but I think what we need at a deeper level rather than information is participation and using the expertise in the House to collaborate, because we're dealing with adaptive networks. Just as the terrorists are changing as they find out methods that we have, one of the things I think that would be helpful to maintain the constitutional oversight that's necessary is for the administration to work closely with the subcommittees in Congress, and specifically those members with expertise on these issues and understanding perhaps the political dimension in a way that many in the agencies may not, to assure that we can have a robust, flexible, and responsive system, and one that can adapt to the continuing changes in technology and the way our enemies operate. I appreciate you being here today, and I look forward to the discussion. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cleaver.
Because I respect the seniority system, and I was here late, I'll wait and go next if it's okay.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you much, Madam Kelly. And again, I want to congratulate this committee under the leadership of Chairman Kelly for providing the leadership on a very intense and important issue of terrorist financing. And I'm very pleased to serve with her on this committee. I've been to every meeting. I think it's very important, Secretary Levey, that we understand what we are really saying here. What we're saying is this administration needs to understand that they're not the only ones who are concerned about the war on terror. The American people elected a Congress, men and women who care about this country, who are just as concerned about this fight on terror as the President is. He has no monopoly on that. What is a paramount concern to me is that the framers of the Constitution put this government together. And they put it together, and the phrase that John Adams used was, we put this government together in a manner that is a balance of a delicate nature, meaning that there is a separation of power. It's not just the executive branch. They put the executive branch there to execute and administrate, but they put the Congress of the United States here so that we might be able to handle the purse strings, but most importantly, to provide the oversight. And what it appears to me that this committee, and the President seems to think this committee is not a committee of oversight, but a committee of hindsight. We're here to tell this administration that we're not a committee of hindsight. We're going to do our job that the American people put us here to do. Now, it's not the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times or even the Wall Street Journal or any of our distinguished newspapers that need to be called to task. It is this administration. The leaks didn't come from the New York Times. They came from people in your administration. The fundamental question has to be, when is this administration going to look in the mirror? That's where you need to look. Let that message go back to this administration. We care about it. Why don't you have people over there with the loyalty? Where is your test? Where is your examination for people who work in this administration? What are you doing to seal the leaks? The other issue that is of paramount, Mr. Levey, is the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. They're precious. Our men and women of many years throughout the history of this country died on the battlefield so that we could have that First Amendment, which is the freedom of the press, so that we could have that Fourth Amendment, which protects our privacy. It is along those lines that I would like to question you this afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I'll be very brief. First of all, I think I go along with the statements by the ranking member that members from both sides have the same bottom line interest to make sure that the job gets done, but within a constitutional framework. I'll just be listening to your testimony on three quick points. One is the aspect of why it is, well, I can go back to my constituents and tell them why it is that the information from programs such like SWIFT is vital to the overall program, but does not go to the point that Mr. Paul raised, is just providing us with just too much information. Secondly, how can I assure them that the average or the majority of Americans, their financial information is not going to be within, or is it not going to be within the information that you look at? And thirdly, to the overall issue of information going out to the public, to the question of was the information that was reported in all the papers, what have you, truly unique and new information to the public, or was it actually information, as we've heard both here and on the floor of the House, information that really was out there to the in the general domain prior to this? And if it was information that was out in the general domain prior to this, is this something that your program looks at and should have done something to dissuade them from putting it on their website, that how they work with the government and that the general public had this as access to information in the past? But I appreciate you being here, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Now, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. Actually, I guess the Ranking Chair, Mr. Frank. Undersecretary Levey, thank you for participating in this hearing, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the administration's efforts to combat terrorism and how you plan to implement communication between this administration and the Congress as we address this critical issue of fighting terrorism. Among the critical institutional issues that this topic has helped to shed light on is the importance of congressional oversight with respect to fighting terrorism and implementing other federal programs and activities. I'm sure that my colleagues and the administration will agree that congressional oversight is an integral part of our system of checks and balances, as fundamental to our nation as the right to vote. And as a member of Congress, I believe that it is incumbent upon this body not only to protect the people from terrorists, but to also ensure that our government respects our Constitution and follows the rule of law. Again, I look forward to hearing your testimony, and I have some very, very clear questions that I'd like for you to address. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. McHenry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I certainly appreciate you holding this important hearing. today, and I certainly appreciate the Secretary taking the time to be here. I think of major importance to this committee and to Congress and to the public at large is the question of, is the government doing enough to protect us from future attacks? And I think that is at the heart what this is all about. You have some that just want to put their head in the sand and say that we will just duck and cover and avoid the next attack. But I think that's a horrible policy. That's a cut-and-run policy. That's ignoring the world as it is policy. And I'm grateful that this executive branch and you, Mr. Secretary, have taken on this task. I mean, after all, you are the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Intelligence. What are you supposed to be doing other than figuring out the financial transactions of the terrorists and harvesting that intelligence? Now, I certainly appreciate the fact that this was disclosed to the Intelligence Committee as it should be. I understand their special place and their special protections in Congress of that information so that we can provide necessary insurance that it's not let out to the public. I do think it's horrible what the New York Times has done to this program, but I do commend you, Mr. Secretary, for working hard every day. I look forward to your testimony and the opportunity for you to answer some questions today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Moore.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and our ranking member. I want to welcome the Undersecretary to this very important hearing. It must be a relief to see me speak because I am the last, have the least seniority on this committee, and so certainly this part of the inquiry will be over soon. I can tell you that as a new member of Congress, I was not here on 9/11. I was not here for the debate on the Patriot Act and other things, but I do, as a citizen at that time, I do recall the many, many discussions and debates that were held and statements that were made by people on both sides of the aisle about how our enemies were jealous of our freedoms, that a victory to the terrorists would be that they would be able to undermine our freedoms, undermine our system of democracy, which they held in great contempt and disdain. Part of the system and our way of life of government that we revere so much is, in fact, this shared power, this congressional oversight of the people. And I am wondering, as we begin this hearing, I do want you to keep this in mind. Are we indeed capitulating to that very fear by an administration that has determined that our need to surreptitiously examine financial records is it's more important to capitulate to that fear than it is to include the Congress of the United States in their oversight role and to make sure that we are not conducting warrantless searches without the consent of the people. Are we indeed capitulating to that fear? I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moore. Mr. Baucus.
I thank the chairman. Secretary Levey, I almost feel like apologizing to you. There are obviously not only many newspapers in this country, but there are many members of Congress who simply will not acknowledge what is a fact. And that's, number one, this is a legal program. The legal foundation of this program is well established. In fact, it's not been questioned by any of the newspapers. The New York Times has actually admitted that this program does, in fact, have a sound legal basis. And number two, the program is necessary. The New York Times, 2 weeks after 9/11, in an editorial, urged the administration to start such programs as this. And the third thing that no one has disputed is this is a very successful program. I mean, that's one thing. It's legal, it's necessary, and it's successful. The one point of debate has been whether or not this classified, secret, covert operation, whether or not members of Congress or newspapers had the right to print publicly the sources of our information, the methods we were using, and the details of the program. And I would hope that members of this Congress and newspapers and the media would realize that that decision, which the administration has said compromised this program, that decision is not given under our Constitution to either newspapers or members of Congress. And for members of this Congress, if I had gone out, held a press conference, and revealed this information, I could have been criminally prosecuted. And when newspapers reveal classified, secret information, which not only compromises the program but compromises our allies overseas, to me, it's inexcusable and reprehensible. And I am sorry that your job of protecting this country is being made more difficult by not only members of this Congress but by the media.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baucus. We have before us Undersecretary Levey. He is Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And Secretary Levey, Secretary Levey, I understand that the problem here is not the program itself. The problem that this committee has is that we have a charge to provide oversight over the legislative arena to make sure that there's not anything going on that might in some way inherently damage the public of the United States. That's what our committee is charged to do. Given that, as you know, some people have lamented that public disclosure of this program has essentially rendered it defunct. We now would like to hear your opening statement, and then we will follow that with questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kelly, Congressman Frank, distinguished members of the committee. This is my 5th time appearing before your committee in the past 2 years in what has been an ongoing and fruitful discussion of our government's efforts to track and combat terrorist financing. It's clear from everyone's opening statements that we share the same mission, which is to succeed in disrupting those terrorists. The program we're discussing today, the Terrorist Financing Tracking Program, has supplied a powerful source of intelligence that has greatly advanced that mission to track and disrupt terrorists. Counterterrorism officials place a heavy premium on financial intelligence because it is rich and accurate. When terrorist supporters send or receive money, they may provide the kind of concrete leads that can advance a terrorism investigation. As 9/11 Commission Chairman Lee Hamilton testified before this committee in 2004, and I quote, "Following the money to identify terrorist operatives and sympathizers provides a particularly powerful tool in the fight against terrorist groups. Use of this tool almost always remains invisible to the general public, but it is a critical part of the overall campaign against al-Qaeda." Close quote. That's Chairman Hamilton. The Terrorist Financing Tracking Program was, until recently, just such a powerful and invisible tool. It has been a key part of our efforts to combat al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and its exposure represents a grave loss. SWIFT is the premier messaging service used by banks around the world to issue international transfers, which makes its data exceptionally valuable. In response to a subpoena, SWIFT makes available to us a subset of its records that it maintains in the ordinary course of business in the United States. SWIFT data consists of records of completed financial transactions, largely overseas transfers. It does not contain, for the most part, information on ordinary transactions made by individuals in the United States, such as deposits, withdrawals, ATM transactions, and the like. It does not provide access to individual bank account information. The program is consistent with privacy laws as well as Treasury's longstanding commitment to protect sensitive financial data. The SWIFT subpoena that we issue is powerful but narrow. We cannot simply browse through the records that SWIFT turns over. We are only able to see that information that is responsive to targeted searches in the context of a specific terrorism investigation. The data cannot be searched unless the analyst first articulates and enters into a computer the justification that links that target of the search to a terrorism investigation. I want to emphasize that we cannot search this data for evidence of non-terrorist related crimes such as tax evasion, economic espionage, money laundering, or other criminal activity. As a result, we have accessed only a minute fraction of the data that SWIFT has provided. Because we agree with Mr. Frank that people aren't perfect and the people in government are not perfect either, the program we have instituted multiple overlapping layers of governmental and independent controls to assure that the data is only searched for terrorism purposes and that the data is properly handled. SWIFT representatives are able to monitor our searches in real time and stop any one of them if they have any concerns about the links to terrorism. In addition, a record is kept of every search that is done, and those records are reviewed by SWIFT's representatives and an outside independent auditor. Moreover, Congress was informed of this program in the traditional way in such matters through the Intelligence Committee. The program has also delivered results. It provides counterterrorism analysts with a unique and powerful tool to track terrorist networks. To cite one prominent example, the program played an important role in the investigation that culminated in the capture of Hambali, who, as you know, is JI's operations chief and masterminded the deadly bombings in Bali in 2002. But beyond these headline cases, the program has proved its worth in many quieter but equally significant ways. Anyone who has tried to piece together a complex terrorism investigation with months of sweat and dead ends knows how important it can be to uncover a new connection or a new personal identifier. This program generated just such leads on a regular basis. Some observers, including some members of this committee, have argued that the disclosure of this program did little damage because terrorist facilitators are smart and they already knew to avoid the banking system. They note that we were quite open, that we were following the money and trying to track financial transactions. But let me respond to this issue firsthand. When I was asked to oversee this program nearly 2 years ago, I requested that the written output from this program be part of my intelligence briefing every single morning. Every day I go into our SCIF and I get my intelligence book, and behind tab 11 of my book is the output from this program. I can't remember a single day when my intelligence book hasn't included concrete leads from this program, and most often many more than one. Now, one can debate the reasons why, but the fact is that financiers and associates of terrorist networks have continued to use the banking system, and this program continued to show us who they are and how they do so. In short, the terrorist finance tracking program has been extremely valuable. It's grounded in law and bounded by safeguards. It represents exactly what I believe our citizens hope we are doing to prosecute the war on terror. Finally, much has been said about the newspaper's decision to publish information about this program. As a government official, and as mentioned here today, I must point out that the newspapers almost certainly would not have known about this program if someone had not violated his or her duty to protect this secret. At the same time, I do very much regret the newspaper's decision to publish what they knew. Tracking terrorist money trails is difficult enough without having our sources and methods revealed. I can assure you, however, that our efforts will not wane. We will continue to do everything in our power to follow terrorist money trails and disrupt their activities. We are absolutely committed to this mission, and I know this committee is as well. I look forward to answering your questions about this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Levey. Without objection, your full opening statement will be made part of the record.
Thank you.
I'm going back to something I said before, which is that there are people who have lamented that public disclosure of this program has essentially rendered it defunct. 9/11 Commission co-chair Tom Kane said, and I quote, "I think it's over." I'm interested in exploring this suggestion that the program's no longer useful. You've testified before Congress that there was a lag between what Saudi Arabia said and what Saudi Arabia did regarding their efforts to fight terror finance, and you and others in government have raised concerns about wealthy individuals and charities based in Saudi Arabia. Given the nature of the data that passes through the SWIFT system, it seems reasonable to conclude that the tracking program may continue to be particularly useful in monitoring the activities of charities and wealthy individuals who support terrorism under the veil of legitimacy. Generally speaking, how, if at all, has the SWIFT program helped you assess whether the Saudis and other emerging banking centers, such as the UAE and Bahrain, have lived up to their stated commitments to combat terror finance? And in talking about this, if you'd specifically respond to the suggestion that the program's been killed by public disclosure, I would appreciate it, and I would appreciate you updating your views on how Saudi Arabia and others are cooperating with us in our fight against terror finance. Is the Treasury investigating the leak that resulted in the public disclosure also? So I'm asking you essentially 3 questions, and I will repeat them. Would you like me to? Okay. One is, I'd like to know how the SWIFT program has helped you assess the Saudis and other emerging banking centers, such as UAE and Bahrain, how that has helped you assess whether they've lived up to their commitments in combating terror finance. And in discussing that, I'd like you to specifically talk about whether or not the program disclosure, the SWIFT program disclosure, has been killed because and its usefulness is no longer available to us. And the third question I'd like to ask is if the Treasury is investigating the leak that resulted in the public disclosure.
I think I've got those questions. Let me start by the damage from the disclosure. I think, as I indicated in my opening statement, there's no doubt that there's been damage from the disclosure. As everyone in this committee knows, this is a very formidable enemy. They are intelligent. They do what they can to cover their tracks. The fact that we've now made explicit the information that we're looking at to track their money trails is definitely damaging, just as a matter of logic. The question that you posed, though, is whether the program is dead or absolutely without value. And to be very honest, I think that remains to be seen. One of the things that one has to take into account is that when you talk about a terrorist network, there are lots of aspects to it. And I think you've alluded to some of the key points, which is that you have some people trying to live in polite society and keep one foot in both worlds, one foot in the legitimate world and one foot in the world where they're supporting violent jihad. You have charities and so forth. It may well be that this program will still yield a great deal of value in those sorts of investigations. I can tell you, without going into specifics about any individual case for obvious reasons, that one of the ways that this program has been quite valuable is in the investigation of charities and particularly their attempts to reconstitute themselves after they've been first exposed. So without going into specific detail about how it's helped with respect to the countries that you named in your question, I can tell you that the program has been quite valuable in that respect. If I can just touch briefly on the question you asked about the leak and investigation of the leak. Obviously, I think everyone here knows that the department that handles investigations is the Justice Department, and they would be responsible for any investigation. All I can say at this point is that we have shared information with the Justice Department and are in consultations with them about the appropriate way to go forward.
So you're working with Justice to investigate the leak that resulted in the public disclosure. Is that correct?
We're in consultation with them. The responsibility for doing an investigation in this sort of matter would be the Justice Department's.
I'd like for you to describe the thought process behind the plan notifying Congress. When this was brought up by Mr. Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks to me like the administration sought to brief chairs and ranking members of the intelligence committees on this program prior to their decision to preempt only prior to preempt the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times. My colleagues testified he was told that he was only briefed because it was going to appear in the newspapers. I'd like to know if at any point were there changes made to the program in response to feedback from the people in Congress that you did notify. And I'd further like to know what kind of, I'd like to hear an explanation for the limited scope of briefing Congress. The authorities that the administration you cite in your testimony for the program are the International Economic Powers Act, the United Nations Participation Act, and Executive Order 13224. The International Economic Powers Act is the primary jurisdiction of this committee along with the International Relations Committee. The International Relations Committee has jurisdiction also over the UN Participation Act. The executive order cited focuses on Treasury Department powers, but also references both Justice and State Departments. So why did the administration choose to brief none of the committees that have been put in charge of overseeing the government functions that you talk about, giving you authority? Why did they brief others and not the committees of jurisdiction?
Well, thank you for that question. I look forward to responding to it. I know it's a concern of yours and many others. I should say at the outset that I very much value the partnership we have with this committee. This has been an excellent relationship. We've done many good things together, and I hope we'll continue to do so. As I said in my opening statement, Congress was informed of this program in exactly the way that Mr. Frank indicated in his opening statement, through the chairman and ranking member of the intelligence committees. The members were briefed on this. That's consistent with my understanding of the National Security Act and the customs and practices that have been agreed upon over time by both the executive and legislative branches on working on intelligence matters. As you indicated in your opening statement, these were decisions that were made in 2002, and so I can't tell you the thinking that went behind them because I was not there at the time. I can tell you that when I did arrive at the Treasury Department in 2004, and I was given responsibility for this program, I took a look at that, and it seemed at that time even more appropriate because the office that I had been just confirmed to be the head of is a hybrid office. It's one where we have a policy function as well as an assistant secretary for intelligence and an intelligence office. My assistant secretary for intelligence is naturally a part of the intelligence community. She reports not just to me, but to the DNI. Her confirmation, I know this is a Senate issue, but her confirmation went through the Senate Intelligence Committee and not through Senate Banking or Senate Finance. And we have a hybrid office, and she is the person with day-to-day responsibility for this program. It seemed appropriate to me that the Intelligence Committee would be the committee that would have the primary responsibility for oversight of what is essentially an intelligence gathering tool. And that's why the decision was made, I believe, as it was, and continued until May of 2006.
Mr. Secretary, I would call to your attention the International Economic Powers Act, Section 1703, which requires full congressional notification and on a continuing basis. That's full congressional notification. I would also note that your testimony comments about the fact that you've hired an outside independent auditor for oversight. That's the province of this committee. We turn now to Mr. Frank.
Thank you. First, and I think there was a genuine interest in trying to find out how we control leaks, et cetera. I would say, I know my friend from Alabama referred to congressional as well as newspaper divulging of information. I'm not aware of any member of Congress who divulged anything, including those who were briefed. But let me, because obviously the question about how much damage was done is a very important one. We don't want to see damage done. But here's my problem. You quoted Mr. Hamilton in your statement. Mr. Hamilton said in a long time before this leak, following the money to identify terrorist operatives and sympathizers provides a particularly powerful tool in the fight against terrorist groups. use of this tool almost always remains invisible to the general public, but it is a critical part of the overall campaign. Didn't that visibilize it? I mean, when Lee Hamilton said that, he said, here's a tool that's invisible. Was Lee Hamilton irresponsibly leaking when he said this is an invisible tool and he made it visible?
Actually, I think what Chairman Hamilton was doing was something very different, and I don't think that he caused damage to this program or any other. I think that what Chairman Hamilton was doing was saying that following the money is an important...
Okay, then let me ask you, that's the key question. No, Mr. Levey, here's the problem. We announced to the al-Qaeda and others, it says it's a critical part of the overall campaign against al-Qaeda, following the money. Did they not infer from that we would be looking at their bank accounts? I mean, did they think we were sneaking into the caves at night and going through the pockets of the dishtashes? I mean, I really have trouble understanding. We said this, by the way, I also have seen this reference in December of 2002, a UN communication, public, that said, talking about SWIFT, the U.S. has begun to apply new monitoring techniques to spot and verify suspicious transactions. I mean, was this really not known to them that we were carefully tracking financial records?
I think we can speculate about what the terrorists knew. What I can tell you, as I put in my opening statement, that I look at this every day and it still is providing concrete leads. So for whatever reason,
it still is.
Yes.
So it's still working even after the leak.
Well,
no, you just said that, Mr. Levey.
Yes, it is.
Okay, good.
But the leak hasn't had any effect on the program yet because the data we're looking at predates the leak.
All right. Well, then let me.
I'd like to answer your question if I could. About this UN report and other disclosures that were made. What was done very commonly was that we would discuss that we're following the money. But that leaves people in some doubt as to what exactly we're able to look at. Once the SWIFT program is disclosed, it's my fear that they'll now know exactly what it is.
Excuse me, but the UN reference here refers specifically to the SWIFT program. And it says, settlement is handled through correspondent banking relationships such as the SWIFT Fedwire chips. The U.S. has begun to apply new monitoring techniques to spot and verify transactions. It mentions SWIFT in that reference.
I've read the UN report. I have to admit I read it after this leak because I, like probably everybody else, didn't see that UN report until after it was brought to our attention. But I can tell you that UN report does not describe this program. It does not.
It does say that we're tracking things, and it mentions SWIFT. Okay. All right.
But there's a significant difference, Mr. Frank. The significant difference is that UN report talks about monitoring and looking for suspicious transactions. And I think it's important for people to understand that's not what we're doing in this program. We are not looking for suspicious transactions. We're doing targeted searches on individual terrorist targets.
I guess I would say this. And I mean, look, I want this program to work. My sense is that people do these things even though they are generally aware they're being tracked. Look, people get wiretapped, and everybody knows about wiretapping. That doesn't stop people from saying things that we can wiretap. So, but I do want to go on to...
I hope you're right.
All right, well, I'm going to ask for a classified briefing in a few months as to whether or not there was damage. This is a serious question for us. But I now want to go on and ask, I have to ask this, and I have to correct myself. I said that I was offered a briefing on the 11th of May. It was the 25th of May. Why, if it wasn't important to brief me before it was going to become public, why did you decide after it was going to become public to brief me? What was the point of that?
Well, the point of that was that when we realized that there would be a very likely disclosure, there was discussion within the administration about briefing certain chairmen and ranking members of committees, so that as a courtesy to them, so that they wouldn't read about it.
Oh, it was as a courtesy to me.
Yes.
So the courtesy is that this program goes on for 4.5 years. I've been the ranking member for a couple of years. Mr. Oxley's chairman, and we don't know about it. I mean, did I miss something in Miss Manners? What's courteous? I mean, it just said to me, listen, I'm going to tell you a secret because everybody's going to know it in an hour. What, I mean, and of course the effect of it also was that I couldn't talk about it as much. I really don't understand. I guess I would say if I was to do the courtesy before, after you knew it was coming out, why not before? But more important, it's not a matter of courtesy. And this is, I want to go back to what the chairwoman said. We want to help you make this thing work. I think we can. I think we can look at this and say, yeah, you know, that's a good idea, but how about this element of privacy? How about that element of privacy? We we work with the Financial Services Committee. This committee has on several occasions recommended changes. Now, we haven't always agreed. We passed in our regulatory relief bill a loosening of some of the requirements because we thought we could make the system less inefficient and less burdensome without any damage. Not everybody agreed, but we did it. The Senate rejected that. That's the kind of give and take that I think improves the program. So you know, you talk about briefing, and let me just say again, yes, the chair and ranking member of the Intelligence Committee were briefed on the 7th of March of 2002, just after the program started. There was virtually no briefing until only 3 other members were briefed. The chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and you apparently tried to brief the ranking member. She wasn't available, it says, whatever the problem was, and the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee. That's so between 2002 and 2006, when you knew it was going to be made public, there were 3 briefings. Now, that is not a nearly adequate effort for us to work together on this, and this is not, the program's not in controversy. The unilateralism with which you proceed is, and that's what makes something controversial.
Thank you. Mr. Oxley?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Levey, are you satisfied that the proper requirements were met in terms of briefing the Intelligence Committee?
As I understand this process, I think the proper requirements were met, that you brief the chairman and ranking member of the Intelligence Committees, which is what we did.
And the program at the time was up and running, and you didn't feel it necessary to brief the Intelligence Committee every couple of weeks or the program was operating, they were briefed on it, they knew how the program was operating?
That's correct.
And my briefing with the committee, with the ranking member and the chairman, was informative. I didn't feel upset that I had not been briefed beforehand. After all, I'm not on the Intelligence Committee. This is the Financial Services Committee. And the obligations the administration had to brief the members of the Intelligence Committee, the chairman and the ranking member, were met under the law. And at least this chairman is perfectly satisfied with the way that was handled. All right. We had, as you know, Congress had mandated a FinCEN exploration of a system to review all cross-border financial transactions. I believe it was in the Patriot Act. Could you tell us the status of that?
Sorry. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to. Let me first do that by distinguishing what that program of cross-border wire project, how it differs from the SWIFT program. I think it's important. The cross-border wire study that we're doing a feasibility study on now, that project is both narrower in a sense because it only deals with U.S. to abroad and abroad to U.S. transactions, whereas the SWIFT program is worldwide. But it's also much broader as well because it deals with all cross-border transactions, whether handled by SWIFT or not, and we can use that information for terrorism, money laundering, all sorts of law enforcement purposes. And we can do all kinds of the things that people traditionally think about when they think about data mining in terms of looking for trend analysis, suspicious activity, and the like. We're currently doing a feasibility study on that broader project that you've asked us to take a look at. We've gotten some comments from the private sector as well as from the regulators, which we're currently considering. I can tell the committee that one thing we're considering there is whether we should try to do this as a pilot project to see if whether we can set up the system right and get value for it before we proceed with a larger project.
And once that is completed, then it's the will that be reported back to this committee and the Congress?
Yes, I think we have to do a feasibility study, and of course we have to brief this to our new secretary, who will be the decision maker about how he recommends that we go forward.
Let me ask you about the terrorist finance tracking program. and its use of SWIFT data. What key protections were part of that program that could guarantee Fourth Amendment protections?
Well, as you know, Mr. Chairman, the Fourth Amendment, the Supreme Court case United States versus Miller, that there's no Fourth Amendment right to privacy in the types of financial records that we're talking about here. But we take very seriously the sensitivity of financial data, and so we did put in place very serious protocols and controls. They include making sure that the data is in a very secure place, the most secure place most secure environment, that the people who have access to it are only those with the appropriate clearances, that they can only use this data to do terrorism searches. And as I indicated at the outset, I actually sat down with one of our analysts yesterday and watched how this works. If you type in the target of the search, and then the next required field is the justification, the connection to terrorism. And if you don't fill that in, you can't search the data. And it's that justification field that is monitored both by SWIFT people who are on site and an outside auditor after the fact to ensure that any improper searches are identified.
As I understand it, one of the arguments that the New York Times used after the story broke to rationalize this was, well, this program, everybody knew about it, it was out there in the general media, and that people knew that that SWIFT program was up there and operating. If that were true, why was it a kind of a man bites dog story above the fold in the New York Times?
I think that's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. I can't speak for the New York Times. They clearly thought it was front page above the fold news. I think, as I tried to explain to Mr. Frank, the answer here is that it's one thing to say you're following the money and people think, okay, maybe they're getting suspicious activity reports and whatnot. It's quite another thing to tell people exactly what you're looking at and how. I think that I won't speak for the members of this committee, but the people that I've talked to, very, very few of them knew what SWIFT was at all before June 23rd, let alone exactly how it worked. And unfortunately, that informational advantage that we had over our adversary is gone.
Precisely. The operational details of how this program worked. Now, Mr. Frank made the analogy to wiretaps. I used to do this for a living. Not for a moment did I think the people that I was wiretapping, organized crime, knew that I was wiretapping them. It became pretty evident from the discussions on there that they would have never said that had they known that I was listening in on the proceedings. So it seems to me that this program, which has proven to be very, very effective, and the revelations that really kneecapped our operational actions here and the success of that program is deeply disturbing. To the extent that you can tell us who implored the New York Times to not run this story.
I had a series of meetings with the reporters and with the editors of the New York Times and implored them as persuasive as I could be, apparently not persuasive enough, that they shouldn't run the story. In addition, Secretary Snow had a separate meeting with Mr. Keller to make the same points. We tried the position I took with them, and everyone knows what the outcome was that this program was legal, that it was properly controlled, and it was valuable, and therefore the real newsworthiness of the story would just be tipping off our adversaries as to what we were doing, and I didn't think that it was something that they should do. They obviously differed with me on that and published it.
What role did Governor Kane and former Congressman Hamilton play as well?
As I understand it, Chairman Hamilton both met with the New York Times and urged them not to publish the story, and Governor Kane made the same request, as I understand it, over the telephone, and they made their argument that the story, that they knew about the program, that they thought the program was well run, and that publishing it would not would be harmful to our overall effort in combating terrorism. But apparently their suggestions were not heeded as well.
To your knowledge, did any sitting members of Congress implore the New York Times to withhold the story?
It's my understanding, though I'm not 100% sure about this, that Congressman Murtha did, but I don't know. All I know is that he told us that he was going to, but I don't know whether he did.
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
He told us that he was going to, but I don't know whether he did.
So you had some conversations with Congressman Murtha?
Yes, we did.
And the stories that I've read at least indicated that he had followed up on that?
Yes, but again, I can't say for sure.
So here you had a current congressman, well respected on these issues, former chairman, well respected in these issues, and former chairman, of course, of the 9/11 Commission, both Democrats, along with Governor Kane, former governor of Republican governor of New Jersey, along with the Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm assuming some other folks, perhaps higher up in the administration, imploring New York Times that this would do serious damage to our ability to track terrorist financing and to better protect the American people. And the New York Times basically said, as their famous headline said about Jerry Ford, drop dead. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Oxley said, I used to do this for a living, and he's talking about gathering information subject to wiretaps or others, and I did as well as a district attorney. But I have tremendous respect for our system and the fact that we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, all of which have co-equal power, meaning they all have the same power. And in our system, there is oversight by the executive branch, and that is the FBI or the district attorney or the local police department, by the judicial branch, especially when gathering sensitive private information. And is our system here sufficient, you believe, to protect the privacy of individuals? And number one, and number two, what members of Congress, you mentioned the Intelligence Committee chairman and the ranking member, are advised or briefed? Anybody else?
I think that the system we have in place does provide appropriate oversight.
By whom?
Well, both by Congress through the Intelligence Committee, the controls that we have in place that I've described in my testimony, but also you mentioned the type of process that we use to gather the information. We issue an administrative subpoena in this case, and the key fact that I think is important to point out here is that the recipient of this subpoena, SWIFT, had every right to challenge that subpoena in court. They could go to district court and challenge the subpoena on any ground that they wished to. They had and continue to have the most excellent outside counsel that one could obtain, and they knew all of their rights. They could have gone to court. This is not a situation that I know has been debated in other contexts where the recipient of the compulsion order from the government is not able to or doesn't feel able to challenge that compulsion in court. This is a situation where they not only were able to as a matter of law, but were fully aware that they were able to.
Initially, were other members of Congress, aside from the chairman of the Intelligence Committee and the ranking member, briefed?
I believe that Mr. Frank has the list of briefings. That's better information than I have before me, but we can try to get back to you with...
But my question is, initially, were other than those two people briefed? Other members?
Of Congress?
Yes.
Well, there would be both in the House and the Senate, chairman and ranking members, so it would be four.
So 4 members of Congress, the House and the Senate, were briefed, the Senate and the House.
That's my understanding, yes.
And how often did that briefing take place besides the initial briefing?
We gave them the briefing, and I wasn't there at the time. I don't know if there were follow-up discussions or not.
I would like you to find that out, if you would, please, and provide that information to the committee if there were follow-up briefings after the initial briefing of the 4 members of the House and the Senate committee. Would you do that, sir?
I'll look into that.
Not responsive, Your Honor. Would you do that, sir?
I'll look into that. I don't know whether I'll have that information.
If you do, will you please provide that or tell us why you couldn't provide it?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. With disclosure, with disclosure of the eavesdropping program that's been happening in the past few months here, with disclosure of this program, I think a lot of Americans are wondering, are there other programs that this government is operating right now that we, even members of Congress, don't know about? And I guess, again, I would ask you, as I said in my opening statement, I would really appreciate and invite the administration to bring Congress in here and tell us in classified briefings, if necessary, if you think it's necessary, and I would certainly respect that as a former prosecutor, but tell us, make us part of this whole thing so we can protect our country as well and not feel like we're being kept out of the process. And that's what it feels, I think, to a lot of members of Congress, and that's why you're getting this kind of questioning right now from some people. I would absolutely respect any request for a confidential briefing, a classified briefing, but I think it's important that there really be oversight here so that the 3 branches of government and our system of checks and balances can operate to protect the people in our country. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, 2 things. 2 things arose in your questioning. One, you asked about oversight, and the Secretary said that they have oversight. The oversight, however, is an outside auditor that has nothing to do with government.
Very good point.
The second thing is I have asked for a classified briefing. We have formally asked for a classified briefing to follow this. So we will be having that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Backus apparently has to leave, so we'll go next to Mr. Backus.
Yes, thank you. I've got to go to the floor on the Internet gambling bill, which has been called up. Secretary, I think most members of this committee and the Congress are aware of the Espionage Act of 1917. Basically, that makes it a criminal act to, and I'll just quote from the act, it says to communicate, deliver, or transmit information to any person not entitled to receive it. And they're talking about their information related to national defense. Now, that act allows the executive branch to classify information. And this information was classified information, so it fit into that category. And it makes it a criminal act to communicate that information, to deliver it, or to transmit it. Now, having said that, the case law, the Supreme Court, has made an exception, and it has said that if specific information has been published or released by the government, that it is not a criminal act. Now, it's my understanding the New York Times and some members of this committee have said this information was already published. Would you one more time go over whether or not, and it's not the existence of something. We know we have spies, but if we were to, and we know we have spies in Russia, but if we, reveal the names of those spies, that would be a different thing. And would you go over with this committee one more time whether or not the methods of this program, the details, had been revealed?
I'm happy to, and I think you make a good point. I think Mrs. Maloney pointed out that there are lots of statements made in the public about following the money. Even the word SWIFT, I gather if you can do a Google search, you can find SWIFT someplace, and people have found that. But what wasn't revealed before these articles was how we're doing this, and that we're subpoenaing the information from SWIFT. There were other aspects of the New York Times story that talk about the interagency collaboration in exploiting the data that was classified and remains classified. And it's that sort of operational detail that both was classified and remains classified, but also which I find so disappointing because, as I said, my interest here is not in anything other than getting after the terrorists. And I was very disappointed to see the story because it makes my job that I think we're doing all together here much, much more difficult.
You know, I read the case last night, United States versus Morrison, which says that the determination as to whether something should be published or not, or given to the public of this regard, is up to the executive branch of the government. And at no time did y'all make a determination or publish this information, as I understand it. In fact, you made a determination not to.
As I said, Congressman, we did everything we could to try to persuade the New York Times not to publish the story. I had several meetings with them. I answered a lot of their questions. I was authorized to give them information in order to persuade them of the controls that we had in place and so forth. I spent some time correcting some misimpressions that they had developed in the course of their reporting. I did everything I possibly could to try to talk them out of it. In fact, when they notified us that they were going to publish the story, I was in Italy on my way to go to Poland to give a speech with Undersecretary Joseph on Proliferation Security Initiative. And I had to cancel that appearance in Poland in order to come back to have one more meeting with the folks from the New York Times. And I very much regret not being able to follow through on my commitment to Undersecretary Joseph on proliferation finance, which I know is another concern of this committee. But I felt like it was important to do everything I possibly could in this regard.
Did they give you any reason for why they were going to publish it? Did they?
I think the way I'd like to answer that is Mr. Keller seems to be quite able to speak for himself and has a forum to do so. I'll let them speak for themselves.
Sure. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Maloney.
Thank you. Mr. Levey, the administration strongly objected to the publication, as you said over and over, of the Times story, but the fact that the U.S. was monitoring wire transfers both in this country and abroad was very well known. It was the topic of multiple newspaper articles and testimonies, both here in Congress and other places. It was widely reported that Canada had a SWIFT tracking system, as did Australia, and even TV picked up on it. As one of my interns found, the issue was a central part of a West Wing episode on May 15th, 2002, literally 4 years ago, cross-border wire transfers. I could go into the whole plot of how they found it, but they were tracking it through the central data system, and it was very similar to what's happening. This was West Wing, popular TV. And there was a book that came out by a Wall Street reporter a full year before, or several days before this Times report, The 1% Doctrine, where he goes into the whole deal and how it happens, and he goes on to say that the terrorists had wised up. They were no longer using wire transfers. So really, my basic question is it your position, and I've got to say, you said that there was never a detailed description, but in the security industry news of May 05, there was a detailed description of the SWIFT program. He says, we're not, and I'm quoting, we're not simply running watch lists against the data. The SWIFT messages can be parsed. They can do contain fields. They can be formatted in a way that helps us to analyze. And it goes on for pages about how the SWIFT program operates. And so where was the hue and cry against the security industry news when they published a detailed description well over a year before, in addition to the many descriptions that I put into the record? So is it your position that a significant number of terrorists would not have been aware of this monitoring after all this coverage, but suddenly woke up and were threatened by it after they read the New York Times, after it had been in the Australian news, the Canadian news, the securities news, even West Wing stories well over 4 years ago?
Absolutely. And I know that for a fact because I go into the SCIF every morning and I read my intelligence book, and I see exactly what transactions are still occurring that were captured by this program, which came up in response to our targeted searches. And that's exactly what value the program had, and I think that that value has been compromised by this, this revelation and the discussion that followed it. I don't think that any of the things that you referred to revealed this program, as I explained to the prior questioner. It did not explain exactly how we were doing this, what we were subpoenaing from SWIFT, that we, the United States government, had access to that information. None of the things that you referred to revealed that.
Okay.
And even if they had, the front page discussion of it and the ensuing media description of it made it much more apparent to the terrorists. I know for a fact.
Well, maybe the terrorists don't watch West Wing, but I have another question. Maybe they don't watch it. But you testified, Mr. Levy, that you obtained large blocks of data from SWIFT and put these in a U.S. government database. And you testified that you only search this data under specific rules. But those rules are written by you, known only by you, and enforced by you, and not by any other branch of government. There is absolutely no review. And apart from the condition that SWIFT apparently, conditions that they negotiated with you, there's no check on your discretion at all. In fact, we learned that at least one instance of abuse occurred, but we do not know when it happened or what it was. So my question is, are you willing to provide this committee with the subpoenas you served on SWIFT? And secondly, are you willing to provide us with the protocols or rules you used to search the data? And thirdly, are you willing to give us details about any inappropriate searches to date? We know of one because that was reported in the paper again, but this information would be very helpful to Oversight.
Well, as Chairman Kelly said at the outset, she's requested a classified briefing. Those are requests that we'll take back and try to provide as much information as we can in the classified setting, because I think the proper forum for discussing issues like that would be in that setting, and we'll try to arrange that.
Thank you very much. My time is up. I look forward to the classified briefing, and if I may, Madam Chairwoman, put in writing specific questions we'd like followed in that meeting.
Undersecretary Levey has to leave at noon, so without objection, all members' written questions will be able to be submitted. I will be holding the hearing open for 30 days for questions and responses. With that, we now turn to Mr. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Could you tell me, Mr. Secretary, how many subpoenas have been issued under the SWIFT program?
Mr. Paul, if I could, I'd take that question. First of all, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but even if I did, I'd rather provide it in the other setting if I could.
And how many criminal prosecutions have there been?
Again, if getting into the operational details of and detailed output of the program would not be appropriate for this this setting.
So, in many ways, this whole idea of oversight doesn't amount to a whole lot, because that would be the essence of oversight. My contention in my opening remarks that in a practical sense they have an alternative. They go to this transfer of money through Hawala. Isn't this not a possibility that they could do that? And isn't it quite possible that they did know about our surveillance, since it's been around for a long time? And if you could answer that, and also answer the question I raised about the information being very adequate before 9/11 with that currency suspicious transaction report that told us that Mohammed Atta had actually transferred money. So it isn't the lack of information that is the problem, and just additional subpoenas and information. How is that going to solve our problem?
Those are good questions, Mr. Paul. Let me take the first one first, which is it possible that they knew about this? And I think this is the exchange I had with Mrs. Maloney. I've testified that there's a trend that the terrorists have moved towards cash couriers and hawalas. And I think that's part of what Ms. Maloney was referring to. I've been very open about that. But a trend doesn't mean 100%. Yes, some terrorists have moved to cash couriers and hawalas. But what I was very adamant with her, and what I'll say to you as well, is that I know for a fact that that some terrorist facilitators and some parts of these terrorist networks were still using this traditional banking system, and we were capturing that information by targeted searches through this SWIFT data, and it was yielding value up until the time of this disclosure. And that's just a fact. I don't know for sure why. We can speculate why, but that's the fact. I do know that. And that's what I think is lost. And this question that you ask, and I think it's an important point you're making, that are we just getting more data and just collecting as much as we can? I think our record on this program is really quite good, because what we've done over the course of time is look at the data that we are getting from SWIFT in response to our subpoena. And what we do is we search the data and we see where the value is in that data. And what we've done is stopped collecting from them, stopped getting from them the parts of the data that are not yielding value. And in addition to that, and this really goes to the point that you're getting at, we've deleted the data going back historically that wasn't valuable to a terrorism investigation. And that's a very strong indication of our good faith that we're only using this for terrorism purposes. And that's our only intention in getting the data, and that's the only use that we're trying to put it to.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. We've been called for a vote, but I think we have time to fit Mr. Davis in if...
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Levey, have you read The 1% Doctrine by Ron Suskind?
No, sir, I have not.
Among other things, there's a reference in the 1% Doctrine to human intel that the United States obtains from al-Qaeda. There is a description of a particular operative. There are references to specific conversations that the informant had with al-Qaeda leadership. There's a reference in the book to locations of those conversations. There's a reference to the exact nature of those conversations. That is information that it would seem to a reasonable listener would provide some information about who the operative was. There's also a description in al-Qaeda in the 1% Doctrine of a particular device, I think called a Mabaktar, which could possibly be used to release or discharge chemical weapons. There's a detailed description of how big it is, how wide, its dimensions, what it looks like. It's a comparison of common anecdotal things that it looks like. Obviously, a reasonable al-Qaeda operative reading that book could decide to make a change in tactics and come up with a new device of which we have no knowledge. Tell me why the administration is not as outraged by the 1% Doctrine as is the New York Times.
As I said, I haven't read that book.
Is not a good answer.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. My answer wasn't satisfactory. Please
Well, I'm sorry. I
give me
mean to
another
interrupt you,
chance.
sir. Go ahead.
Okay. I think that we are concerned about that book and the types of revelations that are made in that book.
Has there been any congressional resolution introduced to your knowledge regarding the book, Mr. Levey?
I have no idea. You'd be in a better position.
Madam Chairwoman, can I inquire of the Chair if the Chair knows of any congressional resolution related to the 1% Doctrine?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Levey.
I think I've answered your question that I don't know whether there's been a resolution with...
Do you agree, Mr. Levey, that the information contained in the 1% Doctrine could cost us an operational advantage against al-Qaeda?
I can't comment on the specific parts of the book that you've referenced, although I have read the Muftakar part, but not the others. But from your description, and I assume that your description is accurate, I would agree that those are the kinds of things that we wouldn't want to see.
So therefore, and I'm not going to use up my time, let other members get in, but my point, Mr. Levy, I think is fairly straightforward. This is the concern that some of us have. You're not terribly animated about the 1% doctrine because, frankly, it's obvious the administration was a very significant, extensive source for the author of that book. Frankly, for those who've read it, it's also clear the administration is portrayed in a pretty favorable light. The New York Times, I don't think anyone in this room believes necessarily portrays the administration in a favorable light. So it leads to the inexorable conclusion, Mr. Levy, and I think it's a pattern if you look at the plain disclosures. Your administration is deeply concerned when some sources reveal classified intel. It's not terribly animated when other sources reveal classified intel. And that is exactly the reason why so many people on both sides of these daises have a problem or a question with the kind of unilateral authority the administration seeks to gather upon itself. It is crystal clear that anyone reading the 1% doctrine knows a great deal about American intelligence gathering operations. It is far more detailed and more specific than the New York Times story, and it has not produced a peep of outrage from the people you work for. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Undersecretary, you're Undersecretary of what?
Terrorism and financial intelligence.
Terrorism and financial intelligence.
Yes, sir.
So what do you deal with mainly?
Well, the broad mandate, terrorism was the sort of founding principle upon which the office was created, but over time we've also done a lot of work on counterproliferation and sanctions and so forth, using the financial system and financial intelligence to advance national security goals, including proliferation finance as well. But terrorism still remains the #1 priority.
Okay. Now I recognize that may seem a silly question to you, but we're dealing with Congress here. And based on the rhetoric I've heard this morning from my colleagues, it seems a new fact to them that indeed you're trying to deal with the financing of terrorism, and you have tools in place to monitor the financing systems of these terrorists, including one that was disclosed, a classified program, which I would hope, Mr. Undersecretary, that you do have classified programs to root out and find these terrorists and their funding mechanisms. Do you not have tools to do this? I would say you don't have the answer, but I'm just saying rhetorically it seems ridiculous, the rhetoric that's been used here. Now, additionally, the ranking member of this committee had a level of outrage that you had not come before this committee and disclosed to all that can listen. They can watch it on C-SPAN. Whoever wants to fall asleep can watch it on C-SPAN, about this program. Were you asked indirectly about anything related to this SWIFT program by anyone from this committee?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I don't believe I was ever asked about this program by anyone on this committee.
Okay. Or anything related to it?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. But you did disclose this program to the Intelligence Committee, which also has oversight over your activities.
The Intelligence Committee definitely has oversight of our activities, including our intelligence office, for obvious reasons.
I have two quick questions because we've been called to vote on the floor. You said in your testimony you received written output from the program as part of your daily intelligence briefings, and that you, quote, cannot remember a day when that briefing did not include at least one terrorism lead from the program. Do you believe that this disclosure will, in the end, reduce the number of leads that you'll have in this program? Or have you seen a result yet?
Well, as I indicated to Mr. Frank, we haven't seen the result yet, because the data that we're accessing right now was data that was created before the news stories. It's a matter of logic. I would think that the public discussion of this will be harmful to the program, but as I also said to Chairman Kelly, I'm hopeful that we'll still have some value from the program, and we intend to continue with it.
And briefly, could you discuss the difference, you also touched on this, between the wiretapping program, national security wiretapping program, versus what you're doing with financial tracking?
If you're referring to the NSA program you're referring to?
Yes.
I'm happy to say that I was not read into the NSA program, so I'm happy to say that I don't know the details of the differences between that program and this one, but there are a couple of things that I think are fairly obvious. One is that we're obtaining records by subpoena that are kept in the ordinary course of business. We're collecting business records that SWIFT keeps in the United States in the ordinary course. From what I've read, I think that it's a different legal authority being used in the other programs. But again, I state very clearly, I don't know for sure. I was not read in.
Well, thank you, Mr. Undersecretary. I certainly appreciate you being here today. And just in conclusion, I think it's a big difference that we're discussing here. It's the difference between a classified program and a headline. And certainly classified programs are not meant to be headlines so that we can protect our operational advantage over our enemies. And I thank you for your service, and thank you for your testimony, and thank you for answering these questions today, however outrageous some of them have been.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have been called for a vote, and I know that the Secretary needs to leave. Mr. Scott has a question he'd like to ask. If you could briefly answer that, we'd be appreciative.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me just call your attention to what the Act says, because I believe if this administration had followed the law, had done what the Act expressly says, we wouldn't even be in this shape that we're in today. It clearly states this, that the President shall, not may, shall consult with Congress before exercising any of the authorities granted by this Act, and shall consult regularly with the Congress so long as such authorities are exercised. Whenever the President exercises any of the authorities granted, he shall immediately transmit to Congress a report specifying, among other things, the authorities to be exercised, the actions to be taken in exercise of those authorities to deal with those circumstances. We're not here to talk about the SWIFT program or what it's done or all of this. That's fine. There's no problem with that. But it's important for this administration to understand that they have violated the law. They have not allowed Congress to do its job. You have people who run not every 6 years, not every 4 years, but every other year. The mandate from the people to do our charge. The charge of this committee is the oversight and investigation of terrorist financing. And here we are 5 years after, and no report. So when you look at what the New York Times has put forward, and let me just state this very clearly, Mr. President. This is no ordinary leak. I don't think it's been made known that this is no ordinary leak. That story in the New York Times was put together in the Washington Post by a combination of 20 Bush officials who saw something enough wrong that something needed to be done about this. This is no ordinary leak. This is no story of whether you're strong on terror or not. It's whether or not you're going to stand up for the principles that this country stands for. And had we done what the Emergency Act says for us to do, clearly would not be in this position when 20, not some clerk, not some disgruntled employee, we're talking about 20 Bush officials, administrators in your administration, who saw something wrong with the direction in which we were going to say, let us pause here for a moment so that this is a dangerous road we're going on that undermines the very system. And at some point, this administration, as I said before, needs to clearly look in the mirror and see where the wrong is coming from. I'm going to go vote, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I
gather there was not a question, so I won't have a response.
I would like to go and vote also, but I think it's far more important that we get some of these questions answered. So I'm going to stay here and ask a few more questions. One is one that you did not have an opportunity to answer, evidently, Mr. Undersecretary. I ask you about the tracking program that you mentioned, what might be continued to be useful with regard to tracking the activities of charities and wealthy individuals that support terrorism. The Saudis, for instance, have not yet set up a functioning commission over their charities. I want to know why there is this lag, and I want to know if this program will continue, would be helpful in that regard.
If I could, Chairman Kelly, I'd like to respond to those separately rather than together, because I don't want to talk about the use of this program with respect to any particular country. As I said to you earlier in response to another question, it is my hope, because as you point out, there's a multi-layered factor to a terrorist network, and there may well be parts of terrorist networks where this program, even after its disclosure, will remain valuable because people will still be using the banking system. And it's my hope. I hope Mr. Frank is right when he said that he thought it would still be valuable. I hope that's right, because I don't really care about winning some political argument. What I want to do is get at the terrorist financing, and I'd be happy that if there was no damage at all. Unfortunately, I don't think that will be the case. With respect to the Saudi Charity Commission, this is an issue that I know we've discussed both in this room and in your office on several occasions. There's no country that we've spent more time with in terms of trying to work with them on terrorist financing issues. The Saudis, as we said, this will sound repetitive to you because I've said this to you before, but I think it's important to say the whole piece, which is that when it comes to counterterrorism generally and fighting al-Qaeda cells in Saudi Arabia, they've been extremely aggressive and effective, and their security services have had casualties, and they're really in the fight in a way that I think is valuable not just in Saudi Arabia, but al-Qaeda is a worldwide threat, so when they're fighting cells in Saudi Arabia, that is a benefit to us all. On terrorist financing, there are a number of issues where, as you put it, and I guess you were quoting me, so I know I agree with it, there's been a real lag between what they say they were going to do and what they do. The Charities Commission is a perfect example. We haven't seen a Charities Commission. It's a matter of years now, and there's no Charities Commission. I'm not satisfied that, you work personally on getting their FIU up and running. I think that's a project that still requires a lot of work. The specific thing I was referring to when I made this suggestion about lag and gap in a prior statement was holding individual financiers personally responsible in Saudi Arabia. This is something where the Foreign Minister, Prince Saud, has said that they intend to hold people personally accountable, and that has not yet happened. And as I'd say, there's a lag between what they're saying and the facts on the ground. We'll see if there's a gap between what they say and what they do. This is still, I think I've been to Saudi Arabia 3 or 4 times, and I spend a lot of time and effort on this, and I know you do too. I'm going to keep at it and do everything I can, both to encourage them and to help them fight terrorism more effectively.
We've both been advocates for the work of the Egmont Group. This is the financial intelligence units of a number of different countries. I want to know how the TFTP program complements our technical assistance programs with those groups.
I'd have to think about that a little bit, Chairman Kelly. I think that they may be separate enterprises. They fit together in one sense, which is that effective counterterrorism and, frankly, effective anti-money laundering policy requires the exchange of information and exploiting that information. Egmont is a great forum for doing that on an international basis, and we continue to work on it. New director of FinCEN, Bob Werner, who is taking up the torch on this and doing a great job and takes this all very seriously. But frankly, this program that we're discussing today was one that is separate. It's limited only to terrorism and not to all law enforcement and money laundering efforts like the Egmont Group is. And so it's narrower in that sense, and the sharing mechanisms are different.
How do you evaluate what's working and what's not?
This has been a very difficult problem ever since I started this job. I think this is something we discussed when I first testified. A lot of the indices of how effective we are things that we see only in intelligence reporting, and therefore you have to wonder whether you're getting the full story, because the way intelligence reporting works is you get some information, but you don't know whether there's reporting bias or collection bias or whatever. There are two things I can point to that I take some heart in. One is that as I indicated in my written statement, we've seen a terrorist organization that was under so much pressure that the intelligence suggested that they couldn't conduct a sophisticated attack because they lacked the funding to do so. You saw another indication like that in the letter that Zawahiri wrote to the now deceased Zarqawi, asking for money and saying that the al-Qaeda leadership in Zawahiri lacked money and their lines had been cut off. That's, of course, a great symbol of success. And I also point the committee to the assessment that the 9/11 Commission Public Discourse Project gave us, which was a fairly tough assessment across the board. But when it comes to this issue in particular, they graded the interagency effort as an A-, their highest mark. And I should say, I've seen some news reporting in recent weeks that was a grade for the Treasury Department, and I want to make clear that that wasn't a grade for the Treasury Department. That was a grade for the entire government's efforts, including, I would say, this committee.
Thank you. You said that the G10 central banks were kept informed of the program, but in some countries, like the United Kingdom and others, the Egmont Group is not the Egmont member FIU isn't part of the central bank. So did they know about the SWIFT, or were they left in the dark?
As I said, the ones that were informed were the central bank governors, not necessarily FIUs.
So other country FIUs may not have known about the SWIFT?
That's correct.
And therefore were not able to use it?
That's a separate question which I'd like to discuss with you in another setting.
All right. I thank you. I've just been reminded that there was a question another section of a question that I didn't really get an answer to, and that is the question about the UAE and Bahrain, and whether they are living up to their stated commitments to combat terror finance.
I think the general answer is that we have very good relationships there, and our cooperation is strong. I think I can give you a more satisfying answer if I respond to that in writing, if that'd be okay with you.
That's fine. You can give it to us in a more detailed answer if you'd like to in the confidential briefing. I need to do a bit of business here. There are a number of things that we've been requested to insert in the record. One is the list that Mr. Frank had on what members of Congress were briefed and what the dates were. The other is the CRS report for Congress, entitled Treasury's Terrorist Finance Programs, Access to Information Held by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. The next one is reports of U.S. monitoring of SWIFT transactions are not new. The practice has been known by terrorism financing experts for some time by Victor Comras. Another, a secret the terrorists already knew by Richard A. Clarke and Roger W. Cressy. And the final one, continued debate over the SWIFT disclosure by the New York Times by Dennis M. Lormel. So moved. that they be put in the record. And with that, the Chair notes that members will have additional questions for this panel that they will submit in writing. So without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 30 days for members to submit written questions to this witness and to place their responses in the record. And with that, we thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. You've been very patient with us all. This hearing is adjourned.